I Have This Old Gun is presented by the official rare coin and bullion dealer of the National Rifle Association, Universal Coin and Bullion.
If your closest neighbor is North Korea, you're going to need a good infantry rifle. Thankfully, the guys at Daewoo actually sent some of the semi-automatic only versions into the United States.
There was this era, a bygone era, of semi-automatic magazine-fed rifles that came into the United States from other countries in the 1980s. The 80s, before import restrictions went into place, before other types of restrictions were introduced into semi-automatic firearms in the United States, the 80s really provided this unique period when modern designs were available to the shooting public in a way that they really haven't been since then. Among those, I find one particularly interesting, and that's the model that was made by Daewoo Precision Industries of South Korea. The Republic of Korea in the 1970s indicated a need to develop its own independent firearms manufacturing capability. They had been buying surplus firearms from the United States. In fact, they had indeed relied on firearms that were donated by the United States as a part of the American extension of asymmetrical opposition to the Cold War. So the U.S. government had given a large number of M1 Garand rifles, M1 carbines to the South Koreans, machine guns, and other weapons to the South Koreans. Then in the 1970s, we were beginning to sell them M16A1 rifles. They recognized that it was probably important to develop their own rifles, so they began to develop one.
They looked at a great many guns. They liked the American M16, mostly. They also had looked at the AR-18, the piston-operated gas system. They liked. They also liked the AR-18's dual recoil springs. And so they concocted a couple of home-brewed designs.
They ultimately adopt it and then produce a commercial semi-automatic that they can export to the United States. And this exportable commercial semi-auto ultimately becomes the Daewoo K2.
When people think about Daewoo, they think about televisions, they think about appliances. But Daewoo is a huge manufacturing entity in South Korea. And South Korea is a country that needs to take small arms pretty seriously. After all, they're next to North Korea. And so when South Korea developed its own indigenous rifle for its military forces, they came up with the K1 and then the K2.
I'm fond of it because I own one, and I always wanted to own one because in an interesting way the Daewoo K2 combines several of the great characteristics of some of the most successful magazine-fed semi-auto rifles of the 20th century. For instance, you have a firearm that makes extensive use of aircraft-grade aluminum in the upper receiver and the lower receiver, kind of like the M16 family of rifles. You then have a gas system that is almost carried directly over from the AK. So you have a long stroke gas piston system. Of course, since it uses M16 magazines, it also fires the 5.56 millimeter military cartridge. In addition to that, in addition to using M16 magazines, in addition to having an AK-47 long stroke gas piston system, it also used an FN-FAL type of gas regulator, something that the AK doesn't have, but something that the FAL did. So you get, in an interesting way, a combination of M16, FAL, AK-47, all blended uniquely into this one outstanding little firearm. The result of changing legislation beginning in the late 1980s and occurring then in the 1990s was such that the Daewoo K2 changed its appearance and changed its name. It ultimately evolved into this creature that had a thumbhole stock. They installed it with a pinned and fully enclosed muzzle device, and you ended up with a rifle that gave you basically the same thing.
Importation of Daewoo firearms into the United States has been sporadic. They were brought in by KBI, they were brought in by Nationwide. And here's an interesting thing, when it comes to this rifle, it was actually briefly imported, or at least marketed, by Kimber. The Kimber imported guns are known as the DR200 and the DR300. Some of them had the whole stock, some of them didn't. Interestingly enough, Kimber talked the South Koreans into chambering the gun in 7.62 by 39, which was then becoming a very popular caliber.
In every respect, it mirrors all of these changes that were taking place in military small arms during the latter stages of the 20th century. And in an interesting way, it shows you how the Koreans kind of learned a little bit from everybody. And for a very brief window of time, these great rifles came into the United States in the condition that the Koreans kind of envisioned them.
I Have This Old Gun, brought to you by Universal Coin and Bullion, the official rare coin and bullion dealer of the National Rifle Association. Visit us online for other I Have This Old Gun videos at AmericanRifleman.org.